Good evening. Tonight we drift back to a time when a woman sitting in a classroom was considered, by respectable men in respectable coats, to be one of the great dangers facing the American Republic. Not a flood, not a famine, not a war. A girl with a Latin grammar book. If you're here to unwind, to let your mind loosen and your eyelids grow heavy, you're in exactly the right place. Get settled. Turn the lights down low. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background if that helps you drift. Tonight's story asks for nothing from you except to listen, and eventually to sleep. Before we begin, a quiet thank you to everyone who keeps this channel alive simply by showing up, night after night, to fall asleep to stories most textbooks rush past in a single paragraph. If you'd like to support what we do here, there's a membership option that unlocks longer, ad-free versions of these episodes for uninterrupted listening. But no pressure tonight. Just close your eyes if you'd like, and let the story carry you. Let's ask a few questions before we step into the past. Did a Massachusetts physician genuinely warn that too much reading could damage a young woman's reproductive organs? Did the earliest female college students really have to cook and clean for the male students living down the hall? Was a woman truly forbidden from reading her own graduation speech out loud, in public, at her own commencement? And could you have survived a single week of curfews, corsets, chaperones, and constant suspicion, just to sit quietly in the back of a lecture hall and listen? Tonight you're going to find out. Because you're about to wake up in the year 1837 in a small wooden building in rural Ohio, and you are about to become something the world has not yet decided how to feel about. A woman enrolled and expected to fail. Before there is a lecture hall, before there is a professor, before there is even a single textbook placed in your hands, there is the matter of getting through the door at all. And in 1837, that door is bolted shut in almost every direction you look. Understand first how the country actually feels about you. Higher education in the United States at this point is built entirely around the assumption that a student is a man. Harvard was founded in 1636. Yale in 1701. Princeton in 1746. For roughly 200 years, not one of these institutions considered admitting a woman worth discussing, let alone attempting. The very architecture of American higher learning was raised without you in mind, brick by brick, degree by degree, for 2 full centuries. So when you, a young woman in the 1830s, begin to dream of an education beyond needlework and scripture recitation, you are not simply applying to a school. You are asking an entire civilization to reconsider what a woman's mind is for. Most colleges will not even entertain the question. Ask at Harvard, and you'll be met with polite, bemused silence, as though you'd asked whether the college accepts trained house cats. Ask at Yale, and the answer is much the same. The prevailing medical and religious wisdom of the era holds that a woman's proper sphere is the home, that her intellect, while perhaps charming in small doses, is not built for sustained, rigorous study, and that pushing her toward it risks unraveling something essential in her nature. There is, however, one crack in the wall. A small college in the Ohio countryside, founded only a few years earlier by reform-minded evangelicals, has decided to try something radical. It will admit women. Not as an afterthought and not quietly, but as a deliberate experiment in what its founders call moral education for both sexes together. This institution, which history will remember as the first in the nation to grant women the chance to study alongside men and to actually earn a full 4-year degree, becomes, almost overnight, the single narrow doorway through which your entire ambition must pass. You've heard whispers of it from a traveling minister, or perhaps read a brief mention in a newspaper your father left folded on the table. A college out west that takes girls. It sounds almost like a rumor, and in many households across New England and the mid-Atlantic states, it is treated exactly like one, something scandalous, murmured about, and quickly changed as a subject when children are in the room. If you decide to pursue it, your first obstacle is not the college itself. It's your own family. Picture the conversation. You sit your parents down, or perhaps you simply work up the nerve over a quiet dinner and you tell them you want to go away alone to study alongside men you've never met, in a state most of your relatives have never visited. The reaction is rarely enthusiasm. More often it's alarm, dressed up as concern. Your mother worries quite genuinely about your reputation. A young unmarried woman traveling hundreds of miles from home, living among strangers, is not a story that ends well in most cautionary tales of the era. Your father worries about money, about the cost of an education that, in his eyes, produces no return. A son's education is an investment in the family's future. A daughter's is, in the language of the time, an expense with no dividend. There is also the quieter, sadder worry, rarely spoken aloud, that education will make you strange, unmarriageable, that the very men you might have hoped to wed will hear you've been off studying like a man and quietly withdraw their interest. An educated daughter in the arithmetic of many families is a liability dressed up as an achievement. If you are fortunate, you have one relative, an aunt perhaps, or an unusually progressive father who takes your side. If you are not, you spend months, sometimes years, simply wearing down the resistance, one calm and patient conversation at a time, until permission is granted less out of enthusiasm than exhaustion. Then comes the application itself, and here the college is not interested in making things easy. You must demonstrate a grounding in arithmetic, English grammar, geography, and often some Latin, an academic bar that many young women, denied serious schooling their whole lives, have had to reach almost entirely on their own, tutored in stolen hours by a sympathetic older brother or a hired governess, if the family could afford one. You must also secure letters attesting to your moral character, your piety, your obedience, your temperance. The college wants proof not only that your mind is ready, but that your soul is safely unremarkable. And then, of course, there is the money. Tuition, room, and board must be paid, and scholarships for women are close to non-existent in this era. Many male students can work their way through using labor scholarships or church sponsorships designed specifically for young men entering the ministry. No equivalent system exists for you. If your family cannot or will not pay, your education ends before it begins. No matter how sharp your mind or how strong your Latin, suppose you clear every hurdle, the family's blessing, the entrance examinations, the moral references, the tuition. What you receive in return is not a celebration. There is no toast raised in your honor, no proud letter sent to distant relatives boasting of your acceptance the way a son's acceptance to a seminary might be announced. You receive instead a letter outlining the college's rules, and it is, without exaggeration, considerably longer than the letter congratulating you on your admission. And yet, beneath the fear and the practical worry, something in you refuses to be talked out of it. You have heard somewhere that a mind can be trained the same way a body can be trained, through discipline, repetition, and patience. And you want, more than you want almost anything else, to find out whether that's true for a mind like yours. So you pack a trunk. You say your goodbyes, some warm, some frosty, and you begin the long journey toward a small brick building in Ohio that is about to make you part of an experiment the entire country is watching, most of it hopping quietly for you to fail. You arrive expecting, perhaps, to be shown to your room and handed a syllabus. Instead, you are handed a rule book. It's longer than anything you packed in your trunk, and it governs nearly every hour of your day before you've attended a single class. The living arrangements are the first thing you notice. Women are housed separately from men, an entire wing, or in some cases an entire building, set aside exclusively for female students, with its own entrances, its own staircases, and its own strict hours. You are not merely discouraged from wandering into the men's areas of campus. In many cases, you are formally, explicitly forbidden from it. The architecture itself has been arranged to keep you at a careful, permanent distance from the male half of the student body, as though proximity alone might cause some kind of moral combustion. Presiding over your section of campus is a matron, sometimes called a preceptress, whose entire job is to ensure that nothing improper ever occurs under her watch. She tracks your comings and goings with the precision of a customs officer. A late return from an errand, a lamp burning past the permitted hour, A whispered conversation lingering too long in a hallway, all of it is noticed, and all of it is remembered. Your day, once you are inside these walls, is divided with almost military precision. A bell rings before dawn to wake you. Set times govern when you rise, when you eat, when you study, when you may speak, and when you must be silent. It feels less like enrolling in a college and more like enlisting in a very polite, very devout army, one where your greatest enemy is your own spontaneity. It's worth pausing here to understand why the rules are so exhaustive. The overwhelming justification offered by the college, and by nearly every institution that follows its lead in the coming decades, is protection. Protection of your reputation, your virtue, your prospects. But listen closely to how that protection is framed, and you start to notice something else underneath it. You are not being treated primarily as a student whose mind needs cultivating. You are being treated as a delicate variable that must be carefully managed so that the experiment of educating you doesn't blow up in anyone's face. You are, in other words, being protected from scandal more than you are being prepared for scholarship. And the two goals, it turns out, are often at odds with each other. Still, there is something in that small assigned room, narrow bed, washstand, a modest desk, that belongs to you in a way almost nothing else in your life has. It is watched, yes. It is inspected, yes. But it is also the first space you have ever had that is organized entirely around the idea that you might sit down and think. You make your bed with careful corners because someone will check. And then you step out into the hallway to begin your very first full day as a college student. A phrase that, for a woman in 1837, does not yet exist anywhere else in the country. The bell rings well before the sun has any real intention of rising, and you understand almost immediately that sleep in this place is treated as a luxury reserved for people who haven't chosen to be educated. You blink awake in the narrow bed of the women's wing, the room cold enough that your breath is faintly visible, and for one disoriented moment you forget where you are. Then you remember Ohio, the college, the experiment you volunteered to be. Your roommate, if you have one, is already stirring, and there is a small, quiet comfort in that. Another young woman navigating the same absurd new world, someone who understands without needing an explanation why your hands are shaking slightly as you reach for the wash basin. If you don't have a roommate, the silence of the room presses in a little harder, and you learn quickly to fill it with the sound of your own determined movement, pouring water, straightening blankets, anything to keep the quiet from becoming loneliness. The water in the pitcher is cold. Not cool, not brisk, genuinely, unpleasantly cold, because hot water is not something the budget of a reform-minded college extends to female students rising before dawn. You splash your face anyway, because the alternative is arriving at breakfast looking as though you haven't slept, which the matron will certainly notice and certainly mention. You twist your hair into the plain, modest style that has been all but assigned to you by the unwritten rules of the place, and you begin the long, complicated process of getting dressed. It's worth taking a moment to actually understand what that process involves, because it is nothing like what a modern person imagines when they picture getting dressed. You begin with a simple linen shift, worn against the skin. Then comes the corset, a stiffened garment of fabric and rigid stays that laces up the back, tight enough to reshape the natural line of your waist. This is not a small undertaking. Lacing a corset properly, snugly, the way propriety demands, is difficult to do entirely on your own, which means your roommate becomes not just a companion but a genuine necessity, someone whose hands you depend on simply to get dressed each morning. Once laced, the corset does exactly what it's designed to do. It compresses. Your ribs shift subtly beneath the pressure. Your breathing becomes shallow, careful, more of a series of small sips of air than the deep, unrestricted breaths you might take for granted in another century. This matters more than it might seem, because you are about to spend your entire day thinking, reciting, reading, answering questions under scrutiny, all while your body is quietly starved of the kind of deep breathing that steadies nerves and clears a foggy mind. Doctors of the era have plenty to say about corsets, almost none of it consistent. Some praise them as necessary for posture and modesty. A smaller but growing number warn that prolonged, tight lacing weakens the muscles of the torso, compresses internal organs, and leaves the wearer prone to fainting and fatigue. And then, in one of the era's more remarkable feats of circular logic, that same fainting and fatigue is frequently cited as proof that women are simply too delicate for rigorous activity, intellectual or otherwise. Nobody in a position of authority seems inclined to ask whether the fainting might have something to do with the garment restricting your lungs in the first place. Over the corset comes a chemise, then a petticoat, sometimes two, then the dress itself, heavy with fabric, often layered further with a shawl or wrap depending on the season. By the time you are fully dressed, you are carrying what feels like a small, well-organized tent's worth of material on your frame. Climbing the stairs to breakfast, let alone to a lecture hall, becomes something closer to light athletic exertion, performed while your lungs are already working at reduced capacity, and you are expected, through all of this, to appear entirely composed. Sweating is considered unladylike. Visible discomfort is considered unladylike. Loosening your laces even slightly for the sake of comfort borders, in the eyes of some, on a small moral failing. A woman unwilling to bear the physical discipline her femininity supposedly requires. So you learn, quickly and thoroughly, to project effortless calm while your body works overtime just to keep you upright and breathing. There's a strange, almost absurd contradiction sitting at the center of your entire morning. You have been admitted to this college specifically to develop and strengthen your mind, and in the very same hour, you are laced into a garment explicitly designed to restrict your body's movement and breath. It's as if the world can only tolerate the idea of an educated woman so long as she remains, in every physical sense, contained. Free the intellect. Cage the ribs. Nobody states this principle outright, but you feel its logic in every tightened lace. By the time you're fully dressed, you've often developed a small, private skill nobody would think to admire. The ability to retrieve a dropped item from the floor without properly bending at the waist, because bending at the waist, in a corset this tight, is simply not something your body is currently prepared to do gracefully. You crouch instead, knees together, in a motion that would look faintly comic to anyone who hasn't lived it. Breakfast, once you finally make it downstairs, offers no relief from the sense of being watched. It is a plain, modest meal, bread, perhaps porridge, butter if the season and the college's finances allow, served in a dining hall where the matron or a designated chaperone hovers nearby with the quiet, unblinking attentiveness of someone convinced that unsupervised eating might somehow lead to disorder. Rich or elaborate food is regarded with mild suspicion in this era, as though a heartier meal might overstimulate a young woman's constitution and send her into some kind of unseemly enthusiasm. Simplicity, plainness, restraint, these are treated as virtues in themselves, conveniently doubling as a way to keep the college's food budget modest. Seating is arranged with real deliberateness. Women sit together, often at a separate table entirely, positioned as far from the male students as the dining hall's layout allows. You might be seated only a short distance from a group of young men, and yet the social distance enforced between you might as well stretch for miles. Your manners are under constant, quiet evaluation during this meal, how you hold your fork, how upright you sit, how quietly you chew. Eating too quickly suggests a lack of refinement. Eating too heartily suggests an appetite better left unmentioned in polite company. You learn to treat breakfast less as nourishment and more as a small, low-stakes performance, one where any lapse becomes, in the minds of the most skeptical observers, a mark not just against you personally, but against the entire premise that women belong at a college in the first place. Conversation at the table stays carefully within safe, unremarkable boundaries. Light topics, modest opinions, nothing resembling the animated intellectual debate the male students down the hall are free to enjoy loudly and without consequence. You learn to keep your sharpest thoughts folded quietly away, saved for pages of your own notebook rather than spoken aloud where a raised voice, even in genuine excitement about an idea, might draw a disapproving glance from the matron. And yet, even inside all of this careful surveillance, small moments of real connection slip through. A glance shared with another young woman across the table, the kind of glance that says, silently and completely, "Can you believe this?" becomes a tiny, private rebellion. A stifled laugh over something absurd in the morning's rules, quickly smoothed back into a polite expression before anyone notices. These small, invisible moments of solidarity are how you and the other women in this experiment begin, almost without realizing it, to survive it together. Before you can settle in for a full morning of studies, however, there is often a piece of your daily schedule that catches many young women entirely off guard: labor. At numerous early institutions willing to admit women, the arrangement comes with an unspoken, and sometimes very openly stated, condition. Domestic work is treated as part of your education, not separate from it. You may find yourself assigned to sweep floors, tend fires, help prepare meals, wash dishes for a hall full of hungry students, and in some cases, launder clothing belonging to the male students housed elsewhere on campus. The reasoning offered, when anyone bothers to offer one at all, tends to circle back to the same idea again and again. Domestic labor, the argument goes, keeps a young woman humble, grounded, properly prepared for her eventual role as a wife and mother, regardless of whatever academic degree she might also be pursuing. It also happens, quite conveniently, to keep the college's operating costs low, since unpaid student labor is considerably cheaper than hired staff. Two goals accomplished with a single scrub brush, and you are the one holding it. The physical toll of this work is entirely real. Hauling water is heavy, repetitive labor, made significantly harder by the fact that you're very likely still wearing a corset that objects to strenuous movement the moment you attempt it. Laundry, in an era before any kind of mechanized washing, is an hours-long ordeal involving boiling water, harsh lye-based soap, and enough wringing, lifting, and scrubbing to leave your hands raw and your shoulders aching by mid-morning. There's a particular, quiet indignity layered into laundering the clothes of male students who, in some cases, barely acknowledge your presence in the hallway, let alone treat you as a fellow scholar. You wash the shirts of young men who won't meet your eyes when you pass them on the path to the lecture hall, and the irony of that arrangement is not lost on you, even if nobody around you seems inclined to comment on it. And then, once your morning of chores concludes, you're expected to sit down and perform at the same intellectual level as classmates who spent their morning simply waking up, dressing, and walking to breakfast. The system, whether by design or simple thoughtlessness, sets you up to arrive at your studies already tired, and then quietly uses any resulting struggle as evidence for the very theory it was built on, that women aren't suited to rigorous academic work. Nobody pauses to consider that the struggle might have less to do with your intellect, and more to do with the fact that you began your day with physical labor no male classmate was required to perform. You adapt anyway. You develop a kind of stubborn efficiency, learning to review Latin conjugations in your head while scrubbing a pot, to rehearse the structure of an argument while hanging wet linens on a line. Your education becomes something you claim in the margins of a day that was never designed to leave room for it, defended fiercely against everything conspiring to crowd it out. By the time you finally sit down with your books, your arms ache and your hands are raw, but your mind, remarkably, is ready. Continuing forward now toward the walk to your first lecture, the classroom itself, and what it actually feels like to sit in that room. Reaching the lecture hall is its own small expedition, governed by rules about which paths you may walk, which doors you may use, and how your arrival must be timed and managed to avoid overlapping too closely with the arrival of male students. Certain routes across campus are understood, formally or informally, to belong to the men. You learn quickly which paths are yours to take, and which ones require a longer, less direct walk around, simply to avoid the appearance of impropriety that might come from arriving at a shared door at the same moment as a male classmate. In some classrooms, The arrangement goes even further. Female students are seated in a distinct, separate section of the room, sometimes positioned behind other students, sometimes physically screened off in a way that lets you hear the lecture without being fully visible to it. The reasoning offered is, once again, propriety, the idea that your visible presence might somehow distract the male students from their studies, as though the simple fact of your existence in the room were itself a kind of disturbance. Think, for a moment, about what that actually means. You have fought through months, sometimes years, of family resistance, entrance requirements, and moral scrutiny simply to arrive at this room. And once you're inside it, your reward is often to absorb the lecture from behind a barrier, straining occasionally to hear a phrase clearly, catching only a partial view of whatever the professor has written on the board. You are present, and yet carefully, deliberately made less visible than the students around you. When the professor finally begins, he very often addresses the room as gentlemen, a habit so deeply ingrained that it persists even in rooms where women are unmistakably present, sitting quietly, notebooks open, waiting to be acknowledged as students rather than overlooked as an inconvenient exception to an old habit of speech. It's rarely intended as outright cruelty. More often, it's simple thoughtlessness, a small, repeated erasure that stings precisely because of how casually it's delivered, day after day, without anyone seeming to notice they're doing it. The academic standard you're held to, meanwhile, sits considerably higher than the one applied to your male classmates. A young man can stumble through an answer, arrive unprepared, or simply have an off day without anyone drawing sweeping conclusions about the intellectual capacity of his entire sex. You do not have that same margin. A single weak answer from you risks being filed away by the more skeptical members of the faculty and student body as further proof of a theory they were already inclined to believe, that women, as a category, simply aren't built for serious academic rigor. So you prepare relentlessly. You read further than the assignment strictly requires. You review your notes twice, sometimes 3 times, because the cost of a visible mistake is simply higher for you than it is for the young men seated around you. When you do finally raise your hand, your answer has to be correct, composed, and delivered with just enough confidence to be taken seriously, without so much confidence that it reads, to a room already primed to judge you, as some kind of unseemly boldness. There's a particular, quiet satisfaction, though, in understanding a difficult passage or solving a complicated problem before the young man seated next to you has managed it. You rarely announce this understanding out loud. That would be its own kind of impropriety. But you carry the private knowledge of it with you all the same. A small, steady confidence that slowly accumulates over the course of the term, entirely independent of whether the professor ever calls on you to share it. By the time the lecture ends and the male students file out, chatting easily among themselves, you gather your notes with the quiet, private understanding that the experiment everyone was so certain would fail is, in fact, proceeding rather differently than expected. You understood the material. You kept pace. In many cases, you exceeded it. Nobody in the room may have said so out loud, but you know it, and for now, that has to be enough. Now let's slow down and spend real time inside the ideas that were used to justify everything you've experienced so far, because understanding them fully is part of understanding what these women were actually up against. By the middle of the 19th century, a certain kind of confident, respectable medical opinion has settled itself into American culture, and it does not favor you. The theory, stated plainly, goes something like this. The human body possesses only a limited, finite supply of vital energy. Every organ and system draws from this same shared reservoir. And if a young woman devotes too much of that reserve to intellectual exertion, memorizing Latin declensions, working through mathematics, absorbing dense philosophical texts, she is, in effect, stealing that energy away from her reproductive organs, which the era considers her body's true and primary purpose. This is not a fringe idea whispered in the margins. It is published, seriously and at length, by respected physicians in respected volumes, presented with the full confidence of established science. One of the era's most influential voices on the subject writes an entire book warning that rigorous education will produce a generation of sickly, nervous, infertile women. A dire prediction offered not as speculation, but as settled medical fact, footnoted and authoritative in tone, even though the underlying evidence amounts to very little beyond assumption dressed up in scientific language. What makes the theory so remarkably durable, so difficult to argue against, is the way it's constructed. If you remain healthy throughout your studies, the answer isn't that the theory is wrong, it's simply that the damage hasn't manifested yet. If you fall ill or grow exhausted or suffer from headaches, the theory is considered confirmed. There is no version of your physical experience that can actually disprove it, because your body has been quietly transformed into a kind of courtroom where the verdict was written long before you ever enrolled. Living beneath this theory means living with a low, persistent hum of anxiety attached to your own ambition. A headache after a long evening of reading becomes something to worry about. Fatigue after a demanding week becomes, in the minds of skeptics, evidence rather than simple exhaustion. And what almost nobody in a position of authority seems willing to seriously consider is the far more obvious explanation sitting in plain view, that your exhaustion might have considerably more to do with a corset compressing your lungs, hours of unpaid domestic labor before breakfast, curfews cutting your sleep short, and the constant low-grade strain of being watched and doubted, than with the simple act of opening a book. And yet, day after day, the women actually doing the studying fail to collapse in the dramatic ways the theory predicts. They grow tired, certainly anyone would under the schedule imposed on them, but they also keep learning, keep completing their coursework, keep graduating. The theory makes bold, confident claims, and reality, stubbornly and repeatedly, declines to cooperate with it. Exercise occupies a strange, contradictory space in this same conversation. Mild movement is considered acceptable, even encouraged, gentle walks along approved paths, light calisthenics with wooden hand implements that could not meaningfully build strength no matter how consistently used. The clear underlying goal is to preserve a vague, decorative sort of health, the kind that keeps your complexion pleasantly rosy without ever risking the development of visible physical strength. Vigorous exercise, by contrast, is regarded with genuine unease. A young woman who runs, who exerts herself fully, who builds real physical power, is seen as pushing against something the era considers a fundamental law of femininity. And here the contradiction becomes almost impossible to miss. You are simultaneously expected to perform hours of exhausting physical labor, hauling water, scrubbing floors, wringing heavy wet laundry, while being actively discouraged from formal exercise that might build genuine strength on purpose, for your own benefit. Strength gained through servitude is apparently acceptable. Strength gained through deliberate physical training, chosen freely, is treated as something closer to scandal. Your clothing, of course, conspires with this contradiction at every turn. Even if you wanted to exercise seriously, the corset and the layers of heavy fabric make anything beyond a careful, restrained walk genuinely difficult. The outfit itself enforces the limits the culture has already decided you should live within. Beyond the classroom and the exercise yard, another figure follows you through nearly every hour of your day, the chaperone. Wherever you go, to lectures, to meals, occasionally into the nearby town for some approved errand, she goes as well. A constant, watchful companion whose entire function is to ensure that no unsupervised moment ever passes between you and a male student. The underlying assumption, rarely stated outright but understood by everyone involved, is that neither your judgment nor a young man's can be trusted to prevent scandal on its own. And so, an adult must be present to prevent it for you. The effect on your daily life is a kind of low, constant pressure, a background awareness that you are never fully alone, never fully unobserved. A friendly conversation with a male classmate about a shared reading assignment could, under the wrong interpretation, become the subject of quiet gossip. A moment of genuine laughter could be noted and remembered. You learn, gradually, to edit yourself in real time, trimming away anything that might be misread, treating even ordinary human interaction with a kind of careful, deliberate caution most of your male classmates never have to think about at all. It is, frankly, a lonely way to move through your days. Genuine solitude, the simple, private freedom to sit alone with your own thoughts, to wander without an escort, to make a small mistake without it being recorded somewhere, is a luxury handed freely to the young men around you and denied almost entirely to you, without anyone particularly apologizing for the difference. The rulebook governing your daily life extends well beyond chaperones and dress. There are strict curfews, considerably earlier and more rigidly enforced than anything applied to male students, who are generally free to come and go into the evening largely unbothered. There are designated silent hours, stretches of the day set aside for quiet study and reflection, during which you're expected to move softly, speak barely above a whisper, and generally make yourself as unobtrusive as possible. There are firm restrictions on where you may walk unaccompanied, and firm restrictions on which conversations with male students are considered appropriate at all. The cumulative effect of so many overlapping rules produces its own particular kind of exhaustion, a constant mental tally running in the back of your mind, tracking what you are and are not currently permitted to do, energy that might otherwise go toward the studies you crossed hundreds of miles to pursue. Underneath all of it sits a fairly clear, if unspoken, message. Be quiet, be careful, take up as little space as possible, and be endlessly grateful for the privilege of being here at all. And yet, and this matters, following a rule and being defeated by it are not the same thing. You can observe curfew and still, quietly, burn with purpose long after the lamp is extinguished. You can keep the silent hours and let your mind race the entire time. Compliance with the rulebook on the surface does not require surrender underneath it, and you become genuinely skilled at giving the institution exactly what it demands while keeping the truest, most ambitious parts of yourself carefully out of its reach. Your male classmates, for their part, respond to your presence with a fairly wide range of reactions, very few of them warm. Some simply ignore you entirely, treating your presence in the lecture hall as something not worth acknowledging, stepping around you in hallways, leaving you conspicuously out of the easy camaraderie they share freely with one another. Being treated this way is isolating, certainly, though in its own strange way it's often easier to bear than open hostility. A smaller group takes a more actively hostile approach, muttered comments as you pass, unsolicited opinions about your intelligence or your reasons for being there at all, occasionally performed for an audience of friends hopping for a laugh at your expense. You learn over time to keep your expression carefully neutral in these moments, denying them the visible reaction they're often fishing for, which, if you're honest, seems to frustrate them considerably more than any sharp response might have. And then there's a smaller subset still who seem to experience your presence almost as a personal affront, as though your ability to keep pace academically threatened something they'd always assumed was simply theirs by right. If a young woman can master the same material, answer the same questions, complete the same coursework, then perhaps the work itself was never quite the exclusive proof of masculine intellect they believed it to be. And that possibility, it turns out, unsettles a certain kind of young man considerably more than he'd ever openly admit. Your instructors, meanwhile, present their own wide spectrum of reactions. Some are genuinely committed to the college's founding mission and treat you as a serious student, calling on you fairly, grading your work honestly, occasionally even expressing quiet pride in your progress. These instructors, when you find them, become something close to a lifeline proof that the hostility surrounding you elsewhere is a choice certain people make, rather than some unavoidable law of the world. Others are considerably less generous. Some simply avoid calling on you, their eyes sliding past your raised hand as though it weren't there at all. Some grade your work with a visible undercurrent of skepticism, holding it to a standard just slightly higher than the one applied to male classmates turning incomparably strong or sometimes noticeably weaker, work. And a few, remarkably, use classroom time to lecture at length on the supposed intellectual limitations of the female mind, seemingly without any apparent awareness of the irony involved in delivering that argument to a room that includes you, taking careful notes, quietly outperforming half the students around you. What these harder experiences teach you, whether you asked for the lesson or not, is how to separate the knowledge itself from the person delivering it. How to take what's genuinely useful from a lecture while discarding, entirely, the contempt sometimes wrapped around it. You also learn to become your own most honest evaluator, tracking your own understanding and progress carefully in your own mind, since the official evaluation offered by a skeptical professor can no longer be fully trusted to reflect your actual ability. Your curriculum itself, it turns out, is not entirely yours to shape either. Certain subjects considered especially demanding or especially prestigious, advanced mathematics, the more rigorous sciences, deeper branches of philosophy, are often quietly steered out of reach, not through an outright announced prohibition, but through gentle, persistent redirection. Course offerings are arranged in ways that make the harder material simply less available to you, replaced instead with subjects considered more suitably refined for a woman's education. In time, as the decades roll forward, an entire category of coursework emerges specifically designed to make the whole arrangement more comfortable for anxious critics. Subjects in cooking, sewing, and household management, dressed up in increasingly academic language, and eventually given the more scholarly-sounding label of domestic science. There is real, legitimate knowledge contained within these subjects. Understanding nutrition, household economy, and organization is genuinely demanding, useful work. The trouble isn't that the subjects lack value. The trouble is how frequently they are offered to women as a substitute for everything else. A comfortable, well-furnished path gently nudging you away from more rigorous academic pursuits, never through an outright wall, but through a steady, encouraging current that, applied over enough time, moves an enormous number of women exactly where the culture already wanted them to end up. Money, throughout all of this, remains a constant, quiet pressure humming beneath everything else. Tuition is a real and often difficult expense, and scholarships specifically available to women remain vanishingly rare throughout this era. Many families who would spend freely on a son's education balk considerably at the same expense for a daughter, viewing it, in the blunt financial language sometimes used quite openly at the dinner table, as money that yields no meaningful return. You may find yourself taking on additional work, tutoring younger students, sewing piecework, whatever respectable labor can be fit into the margins of an already crowded schedule, simply to help cover the cost of continuing your studies. And even after years of sustained effort, after countless early mornings and exhausting evenings, after outperforming skeptical classmates and satisfying skeptical professors, there remains one final, particularly striking indignity waiting for you at the very end of your journey: graduation day itself. Many of the earliest colleges to admit women maintain, even at this late stage, a firm rule against women speaking in public. So even after writing a brilliant, carefully researched final essay, worthy enough to be selected for reading at the ceremony itself, you may find that you are not permitted to read your own words aloud. A male student, or sometimes a professor, reads your essay for you in his own voice, while you sit quietly in the audience, listening to your own thoughts delivered in someone else's tone, credited in that moment more to the reader than to the writer who spent months crafting every sentence. The reasoning offered is the same familiar tangle that has followed you through your entire time at the college: modesty, propriety, the deeply held belief that a woman's public voice is somehow immodest, exposing, inappropriate for mixed company. There is, underneath the polite language, an unmistakable current of genuine unease as well. A woman capable of commanding a room with her own words is a woman capable of persuading, arguing, leading. And those are precisely the kinds of influence the era would very much prefer you not discover you're capable of wielding. You accept this arrangement, on the day itself, with whatever composure you can manage, because there is little practical alternative available to you. But something in you quietly, firmly resolves that this particular silence will not be permanent, not for you in the years ahead, and certainly not for every young woman who follows the path you've helped, in your own small and exhausting way, to widen. Romance, in this environment, is treated with a level of vigilance you might expect for matters of genuine national importance, which is, on reflection, a fairly strange thing to realize about a small college campus in rural Ohio. Any interaction between you and a male student is watched, quietly logged in the memory of whichever matron or chaperone happens to witness it, and the smallest hint of anything resembling romantic attachment can end your enrollment considerably faster than a failed examination ever would. What makes the arrangement particularly disorienting is the contradiction sitting at its center. You are told, repeatedly and from multiple directions, that marriage represents the true and proper destination of a woman's life, that whatever education you're currently pursuing is, at best, a pleasant supplement to that eventual role, and at worst, a risky detour from it. And yet you are simultaneously forbidden in the most explicit terms from any behavior that might actually lead toward courtship while you're here. You are meant to marry eventually, but never, under any circumstances, to be seen behaving as though you might. The surveillance around this particular area of your life is remarkably intense, especially given how little actual courtship is even permitted to occur. A glance held a beat too long across a shared hallway becomes potential evidence. A conversation about a reading assignment, extended a few minutes past what's considered necessary, becomes a possible infraction worth mentioning to the matron. The consequences, when something is noticed, land considerably harder on you than they would on the young man involved. Where a male student's minor flirtation might earn him little more than a knowing look from his friends, a similar moment involving you can unravel years of careful, hard-won progress toward your degree. So you learn, out of pure necessity, to live in a kind of enforced romantic invisibility. Whatever ordinary human interest a young person your age might naturally feel toward another gets folded away, buried beneath a carefully maintained, pleasant neutrality that reveals essentially nothing to anyone watching. Even genuine intellectual friendships with male classmates, a shared interest in a particular subject, a productive study partnership, carry their own quiet risk, since anyone inclined to see impropriety where none exists can reinterpret even the most ordinary academic camaraderie as something illicit. There's a strange irony buried in all of this careful management, one you notice fairly early on. Denied the ordinary distractions of courtship, watch closely enough that romantic interest becomes almost impossible to pursue even if you wanted to. You find yourself pouring an enormous amount of your remaining energy directly into your studies, which happens to be one of the only arenas where genuine striving is actually permitted, and even, cautiously, encouraged. The surveillance designed to protect your future marriageability succeeds, in practice, mainly in producing a more focused, more dedicated scholar. Around this same period, a quiet rebellion begins stirring in a place nobody quite expects: the wardrobe. A small but growing number of reform-minded women, some connected to health reform movements, and some simply exhausted by years of compressed ribs and restricted breathing, begin openly questioning why a woman pursuing serious study must also be laced into a garment that limits her lung capacity and drains her physical strength before she's even reached her first lecture of the day. The logic behind dress reform is, on its face, almost aggressively sensible. If a woman is meant to study, to move actively around a campus, to live a genuinely engaged intellectual life, then why continue binding her into clothing explicitly designed to restrict exactly that kind of movement? The proposed alternatives, looser, less constricting bodices, lighter layers, and in the boldest cases, a shortened skirt worn over simple trousers are, by the standards of a later century, remarkably modest. By the standards of the 1850s, they read, to many observers, as something bordering on open defiance of the natural order. The backlash against dress reform is disproportionate in a way that reveals quite a lot about what the traditional clothing was actually accomplishing. Critics warn that women who adopt looser, more practical clothing are abandoning essential femininity, blurring some sacred distinction between the sexes that respectable society depends upon to function properly. Reading these criticisms now, it becomes fairly clear that the corset and the layered fabric were never simply about fashion. They functioned as a genuine system of physical limitation, dressed up in the more comfortable, more socially acceptable language of modesty. To reform the clothing is to threaten that system of control, and the backlash suggests that, on some level, its defenders understood this instinctively, even if few of them ever said so quite so plainly. For you, watching this movement develop, the appeal is intensely practical rather than ideological. You know from first-hand experience exactly how much your traditional clothing costs you over the course of an average day, how much energy it consumes simply to remain upright and composed while your ribs are compressed and your breath is rationed. The reformers aren't asking for anything exotic. They're asking, essentially, to breathe freely enough to actually use the education they've fought so hard to access. Adopting reform dress, or even openly supporting the idea, carries genuine risk in an environment already primed to view any deviation from convention with suspicion. It marks you, in the eyes of more traditional observers, as a troublemaker, a young woman harboring dangerous ideas about her own body and her own comfort. In a place where women can be dismissed for far smaller infractions, choosing practical comfort over strict convention becomes a quiet but genuine act of courage. Alongside this physical rebellion runs a parallel, equally constant thread of moral and religious instruction, woven through nearly every aspect of your education rather than confined to a single formal class. There are frequent religious observances to attend, sermons to absorb, and near-constant reminders of the virtues a properly educated young woman is expected to embody above all else: humility, obedience, purity, and unwavering piety. The anxiety driving all of this moral emphasis is fairly specific, once you learn to recognize it. The fear isn't simply that you might commit some ordinary transgression. It's that education itself might quietly corrupt you, might awaken some dangerous appetite for independence, might eventually lead you to question the roles and expectations laid out for your life well before you ever arrived on campus. Knowledge, in this view, functions almost like a solvent. And the moral instruction exists specifically to keep your obedience from dissolving as you absorb it. The emphasis placed on personal virtue carries a particular weight in this framework, treated, in many respects, as more central to your worth than your intellect or your academic ability. You are taught, both explicitly and through countless smaller daily reminders, to understand yourself first and foremost as a guardian of your own moral purity, and only secondarily as a serious thinking person engaged in serious academic work. It's a strange ordering of priorities for an institution supposedly built around the cultivation of the mind, and you notice the inconsistency even if you rarely say so aloud. And yet, faith and independent thought are not, in your own experience, truly opposed to one another, however hard the institution occasionally works to present them as though they must be. You find over time that you can hold genuine, sincere religious belief while still quietly rejecting the notion that a thoughtful, questioning woman is somehow a spiritually deficient one. Discernment, it turns out, becomes its own quiet form of virtue, one the college's official moral instruction never quite intended to teach you, but one you develop all the same, for black women admitted to these same institutions, and there are very few institutions willing to admit them at all in this era. Every obstacle already described arrives compounded, doubled, and considerably sharpened. Only a small handful of colleges, this one among the most notable extend admission to black students of any gender, and even within that narrow welcome, the experience is markedly harder, hedged with additional scrutiny that white female students, difficult as their own path already is, do not face in the same way. The scrutiny directed at black women in these classrooms operates on two overlapping levels simultaneously. White female students are watched to determine whether women, as a category, can genuinely handle serious academic study. Black female students are watched to determine whether their race and their sex together can meet the same standard, a doubled examination in which any single stumble risks being read as evidence against an enormous, unfair generalization. The margin for error, already vanishingly small for white women in this environment, shrinks even further for their black classmates. Social exclusion within the student body itself often runs deeper too. Friendships that come relatively easily among the white women navigating this shared experiment do not always extend fully to their black classmates, even within a community that, on the surface, understands itself as united by a shared struggle against exclusion. And the domestic labor already required of many female students frequently falls with particular weight on black women, shaped by broader cultural assumptions about what kind of work they're presumed suited for, regardless of their actual academic standing. Through all of this, a level of composure is demanded that would test almost anyone. Visible anger, however justified by the circumstances, risks being read as confirmation of exactly the stereotypes already working against you. So a kind of relentless, exhausting self-control becomes necessary, absorbing insult after insult while maintaining a calm, dignified exterior that costs considerably more than most observers around you will ever fully understand or acknowledge. What sustains many of these women through such conditions is a sense of purpose that extends well beyond their own individual education. There's a clear understanding that their presence in these classrooms is cutting a path that didn't previously exist, that the women who follow will find the way at least somewhat more clearly marked because of the endurance shown here first. Every examination passed, every course completed against this doubled resistance, becomes a kind of quiet monument, proof, accumulating slowly but steadily, of a strength the surrounding culture worked very hard not to acknowledge. Meanwhile, back in your own family's household, hundreds of miles away, your parents are waiting for news, and the letters you send home become their own particular kind of careful performance. You must reassure them in each one that you remain healthy, modest, and appropriately restrained, that you haven't transformed in their worried imagination into one of the alarming, educated women, occasionally described in cautionary newspaper columns and moralizing pamphlets. You lay out these reassurances first, before anything else, because you understand instinctively that your family's underlying anxiety needs to be addressed before any actual news from your life can be properly received. You choose your words carefully, the way a diplomat might choose hers, deliberately softening or simply omitting certain truths altogether. The hostility of certain professors, the exhaustion from chores and study combined, the occasional cruelty of classmates. These details you generally keep to yourself, because sharing them would only hand your family fresh justification for pressuring you to abandon your studies and return home to a smaller, more conventional life. The disapproval you're managing from a distance is often genuinely significant. Some families view an educated daughter as a source of quiet embarrassment, a deviation from the respectable path they'd always imagined for you. Others are simply frightened on your behalf, convinced you're actively damaging your marriage prospects and setting yourself up for a lonely, unconventional future. Either way, the letters arriving back to you often carry a weight of worry, sometimes even open reproach, landing on shoulders already tired from an exhausting daily schedule. So you perform, in your own letters, a contentment you don't always fully feel. You describe your studies in modest, understated terms, careful never to sound too proud or too ambitious, since visible pride in a woman's intellectual accomplishment is precisely the quality your family has been culturally trained to fear. You present yourself as dutiful and humble, Your education framed almost as an incidental detail rather than what it actually is, the central, transformative project of your entire young life. The loneliness this creates is a particular, specific kind. The people you most want to share your genuine triumphs with, a difficult examination passed, a complicated concept finally understood, a rare moment of real intellectual joy, are frequently the people least equipped, given their own fears and assumptions, to celebrate those triumphs with you. You learn to succeed in many respects within a kind of silence, achieving real things that you can only partially share with the family waiting anxiously back home. And underlying all of this daily strain sits one more convenient explanation. The era keeps ready for whenever a woman in your position begins, understandably, to falter under the accumulated weight of everything described so far. Exhaustion, illness, or simple emotional depletion is frequently diagnosed, in this period, as a kind of nervous condition, offered up as further living proof that female minds and bodies simply cannot withstand the rigors of serious, sustained study. Consider for a moment the actual arithmetic of your daily schedule. You rise before dawn. You perform hours of physically demanding domestic labor. You study difficult academic material under professors who sometimes actively wish you gone, alongside classmates who occasionally mock you openly. You may hold additional work to help cover your own expenses. You do all of this while laced into a garment that measurably restricts your breathing, on a sleep schedule shortened by strict curfews, while simultaneously managing a stream of anxious, sometimes disapproving letters from a family hundreds of miles away. Almost anyone, regardless of gender, would eventually reach a breaking point under a schedule this demanding. But the surrounding culture, more often than not, declines to perform this fairly obvious arithmetic. When a woman in your position eventually falters, the response is rarely genuine investigation into the actual conditions producing that exhaustion. Instead, the collapse itself becomes reinterpreted as confirmation of a theory the culture was already eager to believe, proof, in the minds of skeptics, that the female constitution simply isn't built for this kind of sustained intellectual demand. The prescribed remedy, when a young woman does break down under this pressure, frequently compounds the original problem rather than addressing it. Rest is ordered, which sounds reasonable enough on its surface, but often means, in practice, a full withdrawal from the very studies that meant so much to pursue in the first place. The supposed cure for harm caused by education becomes, conveniently, less education, a mechanism that removes women from the classroom while still appearing, on paper, to be motivated by genuine medical concern for their well-being. Watching this happen to women around you produces a complicated mixture of feelings, genuine sympathy for their suffering, paired with a growing, cold clarity about the actual story being told about that suffering. These women are not proving that female minds are inherently fragile. They are proving, if anyone were willing to look honestly at the evidence, that no human mind, regardless of gender, can be expected to flourish under such a relentless, deliberately stacked set of demands. What seems remarkable, viewed clearly, isn't that some women eventually break under this weight. It's that so many manage to endure it at all. Hovering constantly above every other pressure described so far is one final, particularly persistent warning: the fear that education will render you permanently unmarriageable. Society repeats, in countless small ways, that intelligent, educated women frighten off potential suitors, and that a hard-earned diploma functions in practice as something close to a one-way ticket toward a lonely, unmarried future. A remarkable amount of power to assign to a stack of books and a modest academic certificate. The warning arrives from every direction imaginable: worried relatives, disapproving neighbors, moralizing pamphlets circulating widely through respectable households. The underlying message stays remarkably consistent across all these sources. An educated woman is, by this reasoning, inherently a difficult woman, and difficult women, society insists, generally fail to find husbands. Your education, framed this way, becomes something quietly working against the one outcome the era considers your only truly proper destination in life. But over time, watching the actual lives unfolding around you, you begin noticing genuine cracks in this confident prophecy. You see educated women who go on to marry perfectly happily. You begin to wonder privately whether the men supposedly frightened away by intelligence and independence were ever really prizes worth keeping in the first place. And you start to suspect that the real underlying fear behind the constant spinsterhood warnings isn't actually that you'll fail to marry. It's that, with a genuine education behind you, you might eventually discover you no longer strictly need to. In the cracks and margins of all these overlapping restrictions, something quietly warm continues growing throughout your time at the college. You and the other women navigating this same strange, demanding experience form genuinely strong private bonds, sharing lecture notes, sharing quiet encouragement, sharing the particular kind of dark, knowing humor that only people surviving the same absurd circumstances together can fully appreciate. These friendships become, in many respects, your truest and most valuable classroom, the place where you learn, most convincingly, that you are neither foolish nor weak nor genuinely alone in any of this. The bonds form largely out of simple necessity, the way certain plants find a way to grow through cracked concrete because there's genuinely nowhere else available to grow. Surrounded by open skepticism and watched constantly, you find in each other a form of recognition that's denied to you almost everywhere else on campus. A shared glance across the dining hall carries an entire unspoken understanding. Notes passed quietly between you help fill gaps left by professors unwilling to teach certain material fully. Difficult concepts, once one of you finally grasps them, get carried to the others and shared freely, creating, in effect, a small informal school operating quietly within the official one, teaching each other what the institution itself sometimes withholds. These friendships don't simply end once you eventually leave the campus behind. The women you struggle alongside during these formative years become, over the following decades, a genuine network extending well out into the wider world. A web of shared history and enduring mutual loyalty that many of you will continue drawing on for support, encouragement, and occasionally practical assistance, for years and even decades after graduation. When graduation day finally arrives, after years of accumulated effort, it carries a genuinely complicated mixture of real triumph and quiet, persistent insult. You have completed the same coursework your male classmates completed, in many cases performing considerably better on individual assignments and examinations. And yet your ceremony itself is often noticeably smaller and quieter than the one afforded to graduating men, hedged with subtle reminders that your accomplishment, however real, shouldn't be allowed to go entirely to your head. The day carries an undeniable personal weight of genuine accomplishment. You made it through the chores and the open hostility, through the corset and the strict curfews, through skeptical professors and disapproving letters from home, all the way to this final moment. Whatever the surrounding culture ultimately decides to make of your achievement, you know exactly and completely what it actually cost you to get here, and that private knowledge produces a fierce, quiet pride that nothing said or done around you on this particular day can meaningfully diminish. But the celebration itself often remains a noticeably diminished thing. Where a young man's graduation ceremony typically involves considerable pomp and an implicit assumption of a bright, promising future ahead, yours is frequently trimmed down, quieter, delivered with a careful lack of the kind of fanfare extended automatically to your male counterparts. The underlying message is fairly clear, even when nobody states it outright. Your achievement, while genuinely real, isn't quite considered equal to theirs. And yet, standing there at the end of it all, diploma finally in hand, you understand you're part of something considerably larger than this single ceremony. Every woman who graduates from an institution like this one chips away, in some small but real way, at the broader cultural argument that women simply cannot succeed in rigorous academic environments. Your diploma isn't merely a personal reward for years of sustained effort. It becomes one more piece of accumulating evidence in a growing, undeniable case against the entire theory, the culture built to keep you out in the first place. So, diploma finally secured, you step out of the college gates into a world that spent years carefully educating you, and now seems entirely unprepared to offer you anywhere meaningful to actually use that education. Careers remain closed to you across nearly every serious profession. The door that opened wide enough to let you in for 4 years of study closes again, almost immediately, once you attempt to walk through it into a working life. The realization arrives slowly at first, and then, for many graduates, all at once. You entered this experience under the reasonable assumption that education generally leads somewhere useful, that knowledge earns real opportunity in return for the years invested in acquiring it. And now, diploma in hand, credentials genuinely earned, you discover that the road you'd quietly imagined for yourself simply ends, often within weeks of leaving campus. The professions closed to you are numerous and closed without much apparent embarrassment on the part of the institutions closing them. Law generally will not have you. Medicine resists you fiercely, though a small, determined handful of women continue pushing hard against that particular door throughout the coming decades. The upper reaches of nearly every serious profession remain reserved, by custom if not always by explicit written rule, for men. You possess the training. You possess, in many cases, ability equal to or exceeding your male classmates. None of it seems to matter much to the gatekeepers standing at the entrance of these professions, who generally decided long before you ever applied that your sex disqualifies you regardless of your actual qualifications. What remains genuinely open to you, in most cases, is teaching, particularly the education of younger children, viewed by the culture as a reasonable extension of the nurturing role already assigned to women more broadly. Graduates from institutions like yours funnel toward this single available path in considerable numbers, not always by preference, but by simple necessity, because it represents one of the very few professions where your hard-earned education is actually permitted to translate into an income. Even here, the pay tends to run considerably lower than comparable work available to men, and the professional respect extended to female teachers remains noticeably thinner than it probably should be, given the training involved. The waste embedded in this arrangement is genuinely significant if you allow yourself to sit with it fully. All that developed talent, all that hard-won training, all that stubborn, patient effort invested over years, and the surrounding world declines, in most cases, to make meaningful use of most of it. Minds fully capable of serious, valuable work are turned away at door after door, their potential deliberately left unused by a culture that trained an army and then, having done so, largely forbids it from actually marching anywhere. There's a particular, quiet hypocrisy running through all of this that becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. The same voices that permitted, even celebrated, your education now express genuine confusion at your ambition to actually use it. Why, they ask, would you possibly expect a career to follow from your studies, as though the years of rigorous work were always meant to lead nowhere in particular, as though a woman would naturally pursue serious education purely as decoration, with no expectation of practical application? The door of education gets opened, while the door of professional opportunity stays firmly bolted, and then the same institutions seem genuinely puzzled that you've noticed the second door remains closed at all. But you decline, in your own quiet way, to treat this locked door as the definitive end of your story. If the traditional professions won't have you yet, you press steadily against them, year after year, until some of them, eventually, begin to give way. If teaching remains the primary door currently open to you, you pour your genuine best effort into it, determined to make your own excellence within that field entirely undeniable. And gradually, you find yourself adding your voice, quietly at first, and eventually considerably less quietly, to a growing chorus insisting that education offered without any corresponding opportunity represents a promise only half kept. You understand, too, watching this unfold across your own working life, that you are relatively early in a much longer process, that the doors currently locked against you won't necessarily remain locked indefinitely, and that women like you, pressing steadily and persistently against them year after year, are precisely the reason those doors will eventually, gradually, begin to open more widely for the graduates who follow you. Your very existence, and the existence of women like you, has meanwhile spawned an entire genre of published outrage. Critics across the country produce book after book, essay after essay, and pamphlet after pamphlet, warning in increasingly dramatic terms that educating women threatens to destroy American family life, empty the nation's nurseries, and unravel the broader moral fabric of respectable society. Reading through this alarmist literature now, at some historical distance, it reads less as serious argument and more as an extended, breathless overreaction to what was, in practical terms, a fairly modest number of women quietly attending college classes. The sheer volume of this alarm literature is genuinely striking. Entire pamphlet-writing careers seem to be built around this single, persistent fear of the educated woman. Author after author produces warning after warning, each one somehow more dramatic than the last, each thoroughly convinced that admitting women to serious academic study represents the beginning of the end for civilized American society. The considerable energy devoted to fearing your presence in a classroom functions, in its own backhanded way, as a strange kind of compliment to whatever power your generation actually represented. The arguments deployed in these pamphlets follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Educating women, the argument goes, will render them unfit for motherhood, uninterested in marriage, unwilling to accept their supposedly natural domestic role. It will, according to this reasoning, empty the nurseries and hollow out the home entirely, producing an entire generation of restless, dissatisfied women who have somehow forgotten their true purpose. All of this, the pamphlets insist with complete confidence, follows more or less inevitably from allowing a woman to read seriously and study rigorously. The familiar medical panic makes its predictable reappearance here as well, dressed up once again in scholarly, authoritative language. The pamphlets cite the same reproductive energy theories, the same warnings about nervous conditions, the same supposed physical ruin awaiting any woman who applies herself too seriously to intellectual work. These ideas are presented throughout as settled, established science, weaving together fear of your intellect and fear of your body until the educated woman emerges, in this literature, as a strange combined figure, simultaneously frail and dangerous, sickly and destructive, an object of both pity and genuine alarm. Reading through it all, you find yourself caught somewhere between genuine exasperation and quiet amusement. The overall tone is so overheated, the predictions so consistently dire, the underlying reasoning so genuinely flimsy, that the entire enterprise begins to feel, after a while, almost theatrical. You've apparently been cast as a significant threat to the future of civilized society, armed with nothing more dangerous than a library card and a reasonably good memory, and the distance between that dramatic role and your actual daily life, spent mostly on studying, chores, and careful curfew compliance, feels almost comically wide. But there's something genuinely worth understanding sitting underneath the surface absurdity of this pamphlet literature. Its sheer volume and intensity reveals quite a lot about how much the writers involved genuinely believed was at stake, and how frightened certain segments of respectable society actually were by the changes already underway around them. People rarely bother writing extended, passionate warnings about developments they consider genuinely harmless. The very intensity of the backlash becomes, in its own way, a fairly reliable measure of how significant the underlying change actually was. It's worth pausing, too, to properly honor the very earliest of these pioneering women, The small handful who enrolled before there were even established rules yet for how to properly mistreat them, who walked into these institutions with no precedent to follow and no guarantee whatsoever that their effort would eventually amount to anything meaningful. Every woman who followed them, benefiting from whatever slight institutional accommodations had gradually developed by the time she arrived, was climbing a path these very first women had carved almost entirely through sheer stubborn persistence. Consider, for a moment, the particular courage required to be genuinely first at something this significant, to enter an entirely unfamiliar institutional space with no precedent, no predecessor, nobody who had gone before to demonstrate that the experience could actually be survived. These earliest women had no established examples to follow, no existing proof that a woman could reasonably endure what they were personally about to endure. They stepped forward into the unknown, equipped with little beyond their own private determination, fully aware that much of the surrounding world expected, and in some cases quietly hoped, that they would fail. The scrutiny directed at these earliest pioneers was total and genuinely relentless. Every action was closely watched. Every small stumble was carefully noted and remembered. Every success was grudgingly examined, often with visible reluctance, for some hidden flaw that might discredit it. These women could scarcely afford an ordinary human moment of weakness, because any visible weakness risked being read, unfairly, as evidence against the capability of women more broadly, for generations to come. They carried an enormous, largely unshared burden of representation, and they carried it with a steadiness that deserves considerably more recognition than history has generally afforded them. What began in the earliest years as an almost unthinkable intrusion into previously all-male academic space gradually transformed, through nothing more than sustained, stubborn endurance, into a grudgingly tolerated exception, and eventually, over subsequent decades, into something closer to an accepted, ordinary fact of American educational life. That gradual transformation was never inevitable. It was earned, one determined, exhausted woman at a time, by those willing to go first and simply refuse to turn back when things became genuinely difficult. Real, lasting change of this kind rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. It tends to arrive instead through an accumulation of countless small, stubborn victories, spread out gradually across decades. More colleges gradually begin admitting women. More women gradually enroll, term after term, year after year. What once seemed genuinely outrageous slowly becomes, through sheer repetition and accumulated normal experience, something closer to unremarkable. The physical partitions separating women from full participation in lecture halls eventually come down, no longer defensible once enough observers have witnessed, repeatedly, that a shared classroom doesn't produce the disorder everyone once confidently predicted. The old prohibition against women speaking publicly at their own graduations gradually erodes as more women, in more places, begin speaking for themselves, with the surrounding institutional order somehow managing to remain entirely intact. The demeaning domestic chores once required of female students get gradually shifted over to paid staff, their original underlying purpose, as a constant, humbling reminder of a woman's supposedly proper place, no longer considered quite so socially acceptable to maintain openly. The old medical panic surrounding women's education loses its grip gradually too, worn down steadily by the accumulating weight of straightforward reality. Year after year, women study seriously, complete their coursework, and simply fail to collapse in the dramatic ways once confidently predicted by respected physicians. The old reproductive energy theories, once presented with such scientific confidence, gradually wither under the accumulated weight of thousands of educated women, continuing to live full, capable lives directly in defiance of what those theories had predicted. The alarmist pamphlets grow noticeably quieter over time, their dire predictions increasingly, embarrassingly unfulfilled by observable reality. None of this gradual transformation happens entirely on its own, of course. Every barrier that eventually falls represents the accumulated pressure of countless individual women who push steadily against it, who decline to accept the curfews and the partition seating, and the enforced silence as permanent, unchangeable facts, who kept enrolling despite persistent warnings, who kept graduating despite the diminished ceremonies and quiet asterisks attached to their achievements. The walls come down, ultimately, because generation after generation of determined women leaned their full weight against them, applied steadily and patiently enough, for long enough, that even the most stubbornly maintained barriers eventually give way. There's something genuinely moving in witnessing, across a longer historical view, how thoroughly the impossible eventually becomes simply expected. The very achievements that cost these earliest pioneers so dearly, basic admission, ordinary classroom presence, simple completion of a degree, become, for later generations of women, almost entirely unremarkable. A young woman eventually enrolls in college without anyone around her expressing particular surprise. She attends lectures without any physical partition separating her from full participation. She eventually speaks her own words, in her own voice, at her own graduation ceremony, very possibly without fully realizing just how hard-won each of these now ordinary freedoms actually was for the women who came before her. That, in many respects, becomes the truest measure of what these early pioneers ultimately accomplished. Not simply that the various barriers eventually came down, but that they came down thoroughly enough that later generations of women could take their absence almost entirely for granted. The underlying goal, throughout this long, difficult process, was never really to make individual struggle into something heroic and admirable in its own right. The goal, ultimately, was to make that particular struggle genuinely unnecessary for the women who would eventually follow, to help build, patiently and persistently, a world in which a woman's education required no exceptional courage at all, simply the ordinary effort any serious student, of any gender, might reasonably be expected to invest. In the end, these early women accomplished considerably more than simply earning individual academic degrees. They pried open, through sustained collective effort, a future that had remained firmly bolted shut for centuries beforehand. Every modern lecture hall filled with women today, every female professor, every female physician, every female attorney building a serious professional career, is in some meaningful sense walking through a door that these earliest pioneers threw their entire young lives against, at considerable personal cost, often with no guarantee whatsoever that their effort would ultimately matter. Consider the genuine distance traveled across this longer historical arc. It began with individual women treated as risky, uncertain experiments, laced tightly into restrictive corsets, assigned to hours of unpaid domestic labor, occasionally seated behind physical partitions in their own classrooms, forbidden even from reading their own carefully written words aloud at their own graduation ceremonies, repeatedly warned that their own intellectual ambition was slowly, quietly damaging their bodies and their futures. And it arrives, generations later, at a considerably different world, one where women fill college classrooms in large numbers, lead significant scientific research, practice medicine and law, and shape public ideas so routinely that the underlying historical achievement often goes almost entirely unnoticed by those currently benefiting from it. That considerable distance was covered gradually, on foot, so to speak, by generations of women who simply refused to stop walking forward, even when the path ahead remained genuinely unclear and frequently discouraging. Every professional barrier once firmly bolted shut now stands open, entered today by women who never personally had to batter it down themselves, because earlier generations of women had already done that difficult work on their behalf. The old, once forbidden practice of a woman speaking publicly at her own graduation now rings out freely and unremarkably from podiums across the country. The education once carefully rationed and deliberately trimmed now flows, in most cases, without meaningful restriction based on gender, It's genuinely worth sitting, for a moment, with the full scale of what these earlier generations of women actually overcame. These were never minor, easily dismissed inconveniences. They represented a comprehensive, deeply entrenched social system, specifically designed to keep women contained, quiet, and firmly limited in scope, reinforced simultaneously by law, long-standing custom, contemporary medical opinion, organized religion, and immediate family pressure all working together. To push steadily against a system this comprehensive, with relatively little institutional support and considerable personal risk, and ultimately to prevail, represents one of the genuinely significant, if historically underappreciated, achievements in the broader story of American social progress. The women who accomplished this were not, in any meaningful sense, superhuman figures operating from some position of unusual strength or privilege. They were, for the most part, simply tired, occasionally frightened, frequently doubted, and often quite lonely young women, navigating an extraordinarily demanding set of circumstances with whatever resources and determination they happened to have available. They wrote carefully reassuring letters home to worried, disapproving families. They absorbed insults they surely would have preferred to answer directly. They endured restrictive corsets and strict curfews and open contempt from certain classmates and professors, and they kept going anyway. Not because any of it was easy or the outcome ever fully certain, but because they had come to believe, quietly and firmly, that a woman's mind was genuinely worth developing, and that a woman's future was worth deliberately expanding beyond its traditionally narrow boundaries. Their fundamentally ordinary humanity, in many respects, makes their sustained courage considerably more remarkable rather than less. And their collective accomplishment was never really a finished, static monument sitting quietly in the historical past. It remains, instead, a living inheritance, actively carried forward by every woman today who studies, teaches, conducts research, or leads in any professional capacity. Each of them represents, whether consciously recognized or not, a continuation of the difficult path these earliest pioneers first carved through considerable resistance. So tonight, as you drift gradually towards sleep in a world where a woman pursuing serious education raises essentially no eyebrows anywhere and closes essentially no doors, it's worth sparing a warm, grateful thought for the women who made that current reality possible. Picture them clearly for a moment in their narrow, sparsely furnished dormitory beds, tightly laced into restrictive corsets, occasionally seated behind physical classroom partitions, formally forbidden from using their own public voices, and yet quietly, stubbornly declining every opportunity offered to simply give up and return home. They rewrote, through sustained collective effort over multiple generations, what a woman was generally understood to be capable of becoming, and the ordinary, unremarkable freedoms available in a modern woman's educational and professional life stand today as living proof of that earlier hard-won victory. They pursued none of it for applause, which is fortunate, because for a very long time, genuine applause was almost entirely absent. They pursued it instead for a future they would, in most cases, never personally live to see in its fullest form, a future in which their daughters and their daughters' daughters could simply learn freely, without needing to apologize for the ambition involved. That future is, in fact, the one you are currently living in right now, tonight, as you finally allow yourself to rest. And so, this particular story doesn't really end back in the historical past at all. It continues here, in the comfortable present these earlier generations of women worked so persistently to build, one stubborn, breathless, tightly corseted, strictly curfewed, ultimately unstoppable step at a time. So there it is, a single representative day, and the broader years surrounding it, stretched across the genuinely strange, stubborn early history of women in American higher education. You woke well before sunrise in a narrow dormitory bed. You laced yourself into a corset that measurably reshaped your ribs. You scrubbed floors, hauled water, and quite possibly laundered the shirts of the very young men who made clear, in various small ways, that they wished you weren't there at all. You ate a plain, carefully monitored breakfast under a watchful matron's steady gaze. You walked a long, carefully approved route toward a lecture you were sometimes only permitted to hear from behind a partition, and you sat quietly among dozens of male classmates while a professor addressed the room as gentleman, his gaze somehow sliding past you entirely. You were told, by respected voices across multiple fields, that serious study might permanently damage your body, that genuine ambition might quietly empty out your future, that every book you opened made you somehow a little less conventionally desirable. You endured open mockery and quiet cold shoulders, disapproving letters arriving steadily from home, curfews considerably stricter than anything applied to your male classmates, and the constant, exhausting work of making yourself appear smaller and less threatening than you actually were. And through every bit of it, you kept learning anyway, stubbornly, often brilliantly, one carefully protected, stolen hour at a time. It's genuinely easy, from the comfort of the present moment, to forget just how much all of this actually cost the women who lived through it directly. To forget that thoroughly ordinary things, a woman quietly attending a college lecture, a woman holding an earned diploma, a woman eventually speaking her own carefully written words in her own voice at her own graduation, were once seriously treated by respected voices across the country as genuine threats to the stability of civilized society itself. But someone paid the real, considerable cost required to make these things ordinary. A long line of tired, occasionally frightened, corseted, curfewed women paid that cost directly, absorbing the worst of the resistance so that the next graduating class, and the one after that, would find the surrounding door left just slightly more open than before. So tonight, as you settle comfortably into your own bed, in a world where a woman can study essentially any subject she chooses, pursue essentially any professional path she's capable of, and say all of it out loud in her own voice without apology, perhaps offer a quiet, private word of thanks to those earliest women, the ones who walked through the door before anyone had even established the rules for how to properly discourage them, the ones dismissed at the time as a risky experiment, who quietly, patiently, persistently proved their skeptics wrong, because history, examined closely, can be genuinely unfair, occasionally absurd, and periodically infuriating. But it also offers, examined at sufficient distance, real and repeated proof that people, when sufficiently determined, are remarkably stubborn, remarkably hopeful, and remarkably difficult to keep permanently sitting down. They were told in countless different ways to simply go home. They stayed anyway. And the comfortable, ordinary life you're living tonight stands as the clearest possible proof that staying, against considerable resistance, was genuinely worth it. Rest well tonight. You are, in every meaningful sense, the future they refuse to stop reaching toward.